This is for 5th grade ELA text set, Hope and Resilience. How do people maintain hope and find strength in difficult circumstances? Try to imagine this. Somebody has decided that you have been raised all wrong and you need to be sent away to school to unlearn everything your family has taught you. That's what happened to the two brothers in this book. It's called Home to Medicine Mountain, and it was written by Toria Santiago and illustrated by Judith Laurie. Let's find out how those boys handled this situation. This book is based on a true story. My people have lived in the mountains of Northern California for many centuries. They belong to the Mountain Madu and the Humwai Pit River tribes. In the old days, they hunted deer and gathered roots, vegetables, and acorns in the beautiful baskets they made. Everything they needed to make a good life was around them. The lives of my people changed in many ways after the European settlers came. One change was that Indian children were taken to boarding schools to live apart from their families for the entire school year. These schools were created especially for Indian children with the idea that they needed to unlearn their Indian ways and live as the settlers did. My grandparents went to these schools, and so did their children, including my Uncle Stanley and my dad, who was called Benny Jin Lin. Their school in Riverside was hundreds of miles from their home in Susanville, near Yotim Yum Medicine Mountain. Although the school paid for children to take the train to get there, it did not always pay to send them home for their summer vacation. This is the story of how my dad and uncle found their way home on one summer in the 1930s, when they were very young. Judith Lowry. Benny Lin stared out the window. He listened to the train's wheels singing a sad song mile after mile, carrying him and Stanley away from home. For 2 days the wheels beat a rhythm as they left the pine woods of Medicine Mountain to roll through small towns, golden hills, and then desert dotted with boulders and sagebrush. At last the train stopped in place as flat and hot as a giant's griddle. The children felt restless and cranky, bad as an itch that needs scratching. Stanley and another boy wrestled in the dirt. Benny Lin stood with the others, waiting. A man and woman came to take them to the boarding school. With them came 2 students in school uniforms. Benny Lin couldn't help staring at their feet. They were wearing hard, stiff leather shoes. Benny Lin, like the other children from the train, were barefoot. He tried to imagine wearing shoes all the time. He curled his toes into the dirt, reminding himself now how the earth felt comforting under his feet. At the school, Benny Lin and Stanley were given uniforms and stiff new shoes. Benny Lin's feet no longer touched the earth. His uniform was scratchy, not soft like his old overalls. He no longer heard the sounds of Susanville, the music of birds in the pines and wind in the branches. The boarding school was a world of sharp edges, shiny surfaces, and shouting bells. Every morning at 6 o'clock, the children pulled on their uniforms and marched from their dormitories to the grassy yard. Before, they were Indian children from everywhere, speaking their own language, wearing clothes their grandmothers made. Now in their uniforms they looked all the same, like a row of birds on a fence. Forward march, left face. Teacher's voice rang as the children practiced marching in close order, drill up and down the yard. Back home, people danced in circles to honor the earth. Here, Benny Lin thought, they marched in squares. He lifted his feet high and made a nice sharp turn when the line turned left. In the dining room, Benny Lin looked at his bowl of cereal and felt homesick. He thought of the flapjack and bean sandwiches his grandma made for breakfast. He could almost taste them. "Hurry up and eat that stuff," said Stanley. "We only have 15 minutes. So now we know that these are Native American boys. How do you think of their new school? In every classroom, the round eye of the clock stared from the wall, measuring time in neat little lines. Benny Lin watched teacher writing lines of words on the blackboard. They reminded him of an army of ants marching in close-ordered drill. Benny Lin and Stanley spoke English at home, but other children had to remember not to use their Indian language in school. Once in class, Benny Lin heard 2 Navajo girls in front of him whispering together. "Speak English," he warned. "If teacher hears you, you'll get it." "No talking, young man." Benny Lin looked up to see teacher standing next to him. She held a ruler in one hand. "Yes, ma'am." Benny Lin nodded. He studied the blackboard. He wished the teacher would tell them their lessons and stories as his grandmother did. If she were here, she would tell him about the moon, who stole the grandchild of Old Frog Woman, and how Old Frog Woman went to rescue the boy from Moon's ice-covered house. "Leonard, are you daydreaming again?" Teacher sighed. "You would be an excellent student, Leonard, if you just paid attention. No softball for you today. You may sweep the dining room instead, and think about why you're being punished." So why do you think the students of this school are made to speak only English? At night, the children slept in their dormitories, one child in each bed in a long row. Benny Len felt lonely by himself under the blanket. At home, he and Stanley and their cousins piled into one bed, laughing and joking and fighting over the covers. "Lights out," said the matron. "Quiet now." Every night in the dark, Benny Len listened to the clock. It ticked away the time, always the same amount of time between each tick. Benny Len lay on his back and stared at the long, blank ceiling. He turned on his side and looked at the rows of iron cots, each with a green army blanket on top of the sleeping child. He couldn't sleep. Not far away, he heard one of the little boys crying, making soft sounds like a boiling pot of acorn soup. "Shush! You're going to be okay," Benny Len heard Stanley's voice in the dark. Bit by bit, as Stanley whispered, the other little boys stopped crying and fell asleep. Benny Len felt better, too, knowing Stanley wasn't far away. He fell asleep dreaming of home. So there's a clock in Benny Len's classroom and a clock in the dormitory where he sleeps, too. Why do you think the author chose to include those details? What do you think the clocks represent? In his dream, Benny Len was at his grandmother's house. It was a cold night in winter, and he and grandmother were snug in one bed. She was telling Benny Len about Phenom, the brave brown bear that watches over the people who live near Medicine Mountain. "We are the people of the bear," she said. "If you really need help, the bear will protect you. Remember that if you are ever far away, my little cub." Dreams let Benny Len travel home whenever he wanted. In his dreams, he lived once again in grandmother's house during the long days of summer. While she gathered healing herbs on Medicine Mountain, he chopped wood for the cooking fire. He carried heavy pails of water from the spring. He stood at the window to thread the long silver needles his grandmother used for beadwork. He liked to watch her fingers moving quickly like the flames in the iron stove. Time was different in grandmother's house. It didn't march in neat rows. Some days were slow as a water bug drifting downstream in summer. Others slipped by as quickly as a coyote melting into the shadows. Sometimes when the stars came out, they walked to the roundhouse to watch the men sing and dance around the fire in their feather capes. As they walked, his grandmother's hand wrapped around his. "You're almost a man, little cub," she would say, smiling down at Benny Len. His dream took him to the bear dance, which happens each year when the bears wake from their winter sleep. He heard men playing clapsticks, leaves of sweet-smelling mew decorated their ears. He saw his family around the dance circle with their necklaces of moon leaves. A big brown bear danced in the circle. His uncle held the yokel flag, its tassels of maple bark waving gently beneath the flag. The bear danced toward Benny Len and Stanley. The boys weren't scared. They knew the animals were really their friends. Seymour Smith, dressed in a bearskin, dancing like the spirit of the bear. So why might Benny Len be dreaming about the bear dance? Do you think it's a symbol of something? What? Months went by at the boarding school. Benny Len learned to read and to add long rows and numbers. He played on the softball team with his pals, Tommy Jackson and Woody Naple. He worked hard and he stayed out of trouble. One day when he and Stanley were raking the yard, Benny Len saw Woody walking to the train stop with a group of friends. Woody waved. He and the other boys were going home for the summer. "Will we go home soon?" Benny Len asked his brother. "We're not going home," Stanley said. He leaned on his rake. "The school only pays for the ticket to come here, not to go home. We'll stay and work around the school. We'll go home next year." Benny Len didn't want to hear Stanley's words. He felt tears pressing against his eyelids. He blinked quickly so the tears wouldn't squeeze out. He felt Stanley looking at him. "You really want to go, don't you?" Stanley said. Benny Len thought that if he said anything, he would cry, so he just nodded. Stanley looked at him a long time. Finally, he said, "Don't worry, I'll think of a way to get us home." Late that night, Benny Len dreamed of the bear dance. In the middle of the dance, the big brown bear reached out, grabbed Benny Len by the shoulder, and shook him. Benny Lynn laughed. The bear shook harder. Benny then opened his eyes. There was no bear. It was Stanley, trying to wake him up. Shh, quiet, Stanley whispered. The room was dark. Everyone was asleep through the windows. Silver light from the full moon washed over the rows of beds. Quick, get your stuff, said Stanley. I figured out a way to go home. But we have to get out of here right now. Stanley took the blanket off Benny Lynn's bed and rolled it up with some of Benny Lynn's extra clothes inside. Benny Lynn saw that Stanley had a blanket roll, too. Barefoot, they tiptoed to this hall. No one was there. As quickly and quietly as deer, they slipped from the dark box of the building and ran across the yard in the moonlight. We're going to ride the rails, Stanley explained when they stopped in the shadows. That's what people do when they don't have money for a ticket. I've seen them. Stanley looked down at his little brother. Now you have to listen well. When I say go, follow me as fast as you can. Benny Lynn nodded. We're going to climb a ladder all the way to the top of the boxcar. Think you can do that? Sure, Benny Lynn said. At home he could shimmy up a tree by the time Stanley counted to 10. A ladder's easy, he said. Good, you're not scared now, are you? Stanley asked. No, Benny Lynn shook his head, even though he was scared a little. The moon looked down at the boys, ran toward the midnight train. Benny Lynn's heart pounded like 100 clapsticks in his ears. They waited until the watchmen passed by. Then, one behind the other, they climbed the ladder to the top of the boxcar. Benny Lynn gripped the ladder with his bare toes. He felt his feet felt free without the heavy leather shoes. So what does it mean to ride the rails? Do you think it's dangerous? What do you think of Stanley's plan? They were safe on top of the boxcar. The sky spread a starry blanket over them. Stanley took a piece of rope, wrapped it around Benny Lynn, and tied it around the railing on the top of the train. There, Stanley said. Now you can go to sleep, and you won't fall off. The train began to move, creaking and groaning. The wind pushed against their faces. Stanley put one arm around his brother's shoulder. As the train moved faster and faster, Benny Lynn yawned. After he fell asleep, Stanley stayed awake a long time. Watching the stars, they rode back through the desert, past golden hills, launched like hunters waiting for deer, past flat, green fields, farmhouses, and towns. One night they rolled into a train yard, where they climbed onto another train heading north. In the day, Benny Lynn looked at all the earth-maker's land rolling by and listened to the train wheels singing his name, Benny Lynn, Benny Lynn, Benny Lynn. He felt so free that he raised his arms to the sky. He felt as if he were flying. Why do you think Benny Lynn feels so free? Early in the morning, Stanley woke Benny Lynn. Look, he said, ahead the peak of Medicine Mountain rose tall and proud. Benny Lynn's heart smiled. He knew that just a little farther, their town lay waiting in the valley between the mountains. I told you I'd get us home, said Stanley, as the train rumbled into Susanville. Its whistle sounded like a great long laugh. When no one was looking, the boys climbed down the side of the boxcar and ran all the way home. Even from far away, Benny Lynn and Stanley could see their father sitting on the steps of their house. As they got near, they saw their sisters, who were too little to go to school, playing in front. Juanita, the oldest, ran towards them, laughing. Mama, grandmother, Stanley shouted. Their mother was hanging out the wash. She was so surprised to see them. She stood as still as an oak tree. Grandmother sat nearby, holding their baby sister, Virginia, in her cradle board. She watched them run toward her, smiling for her brave bear cubs. That night, Stanley and Benny Lynn filled themselves with their mother's good food and the sound of their family's laughter. They listened once again to their grandmother's stories of cleverness and courage. Now Benny Lynn and Stanley had their own story. They'd ridden the rails and seen miles of land between the places where day breaks and the place where the sun goes down. The lessons they learned from the journey would be with them always, for the rest of the summer and for many years after Benny Lynn and Stanley told the story of their adventure on the train. They told it to their children and their grandchildren. Always one of the children would ask, Did you have to go back to the boarding school? Yes, Benny Lynn or Stanley would answer, remembering. They didn't mind the long journey so much after that. They were sure they would be back for the bear dance every year because now they knew the way home.